Prophecy Decoded. Decoded the past, reveal the future.
Every empire eventually collapses. Rome eroded, Babylon faded. 80 years after atomic fire consumed Hiroshima, the world stands before a nuclear threshold long foreshadowed in ancient oracles. The Hebrew scriptures did more than hint at upheaval. They outlined a pattern whose contours have become unmistakable in August 2nd, 02. Time sets its own terms. It stretches across battlefields and recessions, treaties and betrayals, sanctuaries and laboratories. It is counted in elections and in half-lives, in jubilees and in sorrow. It moves forward like a column of smoke carried by a wind that mortals neither command nor fully understand. Two dates mark the modern conscience. August 6, 1945, an opening of a door humankind cannot easily close, and August 2nd, 05, fourscore years later. When the mirror of generational measure returns a face, we must decide whether to recognize. Between them stands a single lifetime, enough for power to ripen, enough for memory to blur, enough for responsibility to harden into fate if left untended. The simple question is this: what does it mean to stand at the end of a span? For some, the alignment of dates is coincidence draped in poetry. For others, it is appointment, the convergence of moral time and strategic time, of covenantal warnings and the practical arithmetic of arsenals. Psalm 90 sets the strong measure of human days at 70, rising to 80 with labor and sorrow. Exodus speaks of consequences rippling through bloodlines, the third and fourth generation carrying weights laid by the first. Deuteronomy rebukes a generation warped by infidelity. Daniel names an abomination that does more than offend. It renders a place desolate. The way fallout contaminates not only the ground, but the will to dwell there. The Jubilee Cycle counts out 50s. Release, return, reset. If 1945 inaugurates a nuclear era, then 1995 closes a first cycle of acquisition and codification. 2045 closes a second of normalization and drift. At the midpoint, 2025, the axis groans. The claim is not mathematical proof, but moral pressure, that a civilization which forged the capacity to unmake itself must revisit the terms upon which it holds that capacity. The Jubilee Cycle counts out 50s. Release, return, reset. If 1945 inaugurates a nuclear era, then 1995 closes a first cycle of acquisition and codification. 2045 closes a second of normalization and drift. At the midpoint, 2025, the axis groans. The claim is not mathematical proof, but moral pressure, that a civilization which forged the capacity to unmake itself must revisit the terms upon which it holds that capacity. Imagery accompanies the count, not as ornament, but as a grammar older than our instruments. Joel speaks of blood, fire, and pillars of smoke, of a sun veiled and a moon burning the color of blood. Ezekiel records rains and hailstones, fire and brimstone falling upon mustered multitudes. Habakkuk sees pestilence walking before the divine, and coals burning beneath his feet. As Zephaniah warns that silver and gold cannot purchase exemption from a devouring jealousy. Revelation later imagines bowls of heat poured out, scorches that compel blasphemy from men who refuse repentance. These are not lab notes. They do not specify isotopes or efficiency ratios. Yet they remain unsettlingly contemporary. Columns that rise and cap, skies dimmed by aerosols, flesh injured by an invisible agent, wealth useless before thermal pulse and shock front. It is not necessary to insist on literal foresight to admit that the language returns with a relevance it did not possess before the 20th century taught us new ways to describe old fears. Maps give these words a stage. In Eastern Europe, Deterrence warps under the pressure of proximity and habit. Russia integrates nuclear signals into conventional maneuvers, fields dual-capable systems that compress the time between ambiguity and dread, and may place tactical capabilities in allied territory that shortens warning to a breath. NATO replies by tightening nuclear sharing procedures, layering air and missile defenses, prepositioning formations, and rehearsing deconfliction that must work under humiliation as well as under courtesy. Here, danger lives in minutes. The radar return that looks wrong at 3:07 a. may become a cable at 3:10, a call at 3:12, a decision at 3:14. Legislatures argue in days and quarters. Launch authorities live in sequences that measure fear by seconds. The problem is not simply opposing forces but mismatched clocks. Across the Indo-Pacific, the horizon has no wall. China thickens its deterrent, spreading survivability across basing modes, silo fields inland, submarines under polyglot seas, road mobile and rail mobile launchers shifting like pieces on a board whose squares expand and contract with satellite coverage and weather. North Korea normalizes provocation by repetition. Each trajectory and apogee prints a new contour on the map of vulnerabilities. Allies adjust extended deterrence in a geography laced with straits and archipelagos, where a misread exercise or a corrupted data stream can ignite a week whose shape no war college fully rehearsed. Missile defense promises lights and shadows, not daylight. Hypersonic glide and maneuvering re-entry shrink decision windows. Cyber and space entwine every layer. A blinded sensor or a jammed link at the wrong time becomes the first note of an unwanted song. South Asia keeps capitals inside crosshairs while monsoons come and go. India and Pakistan hold arsenals, and grudges close. Limited war concepts under nuclear umbrellas tempt thresholds. Short-range systems with nukes bait early use. Counterforce dreams and decapitation fears multiply rungs on an already precarious ladder. Geography is intimate, populations dense, sacred sites and military nodes nearly co-located. A midnight incident on a ridge can become midday morning in a city. The imagined ladder of escalation is not a tidy metaphor here. It is a tangle of ropes in a storm. Between the Levant and the Gulf, enrichment cycles, shadow campaigns, and opaque deterrents circulate like currents under a sea surface that looks calm only from satellites. Iran's program advances through sequences of pressure and pause. Israel's posture speaks without speaking. Drones and missiles cross borders even when armies do not. Proxies fight for patrons and for themselves, while each exchange risks tripping a wire that was buried years ago by pride or fear. Choke points carry oil, but also carry reputations sharpened into instruments. An hour is enough to cross a threshold that takes a generation to retreat from. Over it all once lay a canopy of treaties and customs. Now it is threadbare. Documents expired, were suspended, or never matured beyond signatures. Verification regimes built for ballistic arcs struggle to say much about gliders that steer and dive. The rise of dual-capable platforms multiplies ambiguity. Is that aircraft carrying iron or atom? Is that submarine's mission conventional strike, intelligence collection, or something no one admits? Confidence building that once felt routine now feels performative. Exit clauses become strategies. Meanwhile, doctrine experiments at the edges. Some speak of tailored effects and signaling through limited nuclear use. Some of escalating to de-escalate. Others of denial capabilities that blur offense and defense. Add cyber operations that hunt for the seams in command and control, and space systems whose fragility is a poor secret. And the ladder of escalation acquires more rungs and fewer rails. In such a structure, it is not always irrational decisions that destroy. It is rational decisions made under misread circumstances. Beneath maps and doctrines, the civic body carries the heart. Cities run on just-in-time. Grids run on goodwill and physics. Hospitals run on contingency batteries measured in hours, not days. Water for millions is pumped uphill. Food for millions rides refrigerated chains counting on diesel and schedules. An electromagnetic pulse at altitude writes code across transformers and chips, turning a continent's hum into silence. Soot lofted high by urban firestorms cools fields 1,000 miles away. Models disagree on degrees. They rarely disagree on direction. The analogues are not reassuring. Tambura's ash made a year without a summer. Chernobyl made a forest where wolves returned but farmers did not. Fukushima taught oceanographers to read isotopes in currents. Pacific atolls carry stories in their bones that they did not choose. Waste repositories require guardianship that democracies are poor at promising and autocracies are poor at delivering. We wrote checks in centuries and handed them to children whose names we do not yet know. Economics pushes and restrains the cycle at once. Sanctions weaponize the very networks meant to knit the world together. Sometimes they constrain. Sometimes they harden regimes' reliance on existential leverage. Defense industries become ecologies. Skilled labor, supply chains, research labs, districts that identify pride with production runs. Deterrence is insurance. It spends present capital to buy down future catastrophe. The expense breeds constituencies and narratives. Meanwhile, new rails for value slide under surveillance. Cryptographic pathways that can shuttle funds beyond embargoes. Barter arrangements that bypass banks. Third country channels that turn compliance into a high art of plausible deniability. Energy flows draw lines across winters and summers, rendering kilowatt hours into policy levers. Contracts negotiate more than prices. They negotiate time. Memory reaches backward, prying histories from stones and epics. Excavations reveal vitrified fort walls and sands melted into glassy beads. Archaeologists debate whether heat came from conflagration, lightning, or phenomena not fully reconstructed. Epics tell of weapons whose light blinded eyes and burned skin without a blade's touch. Of chariots crossing the sky and days when the sun hid. Of warriors quarantined and bathed before returning to a city that feared their presence. Tablets offer riddles of mushroom-shaped clouds long before the metaphor had a referent. Skeptics rightly demand rigor. Vitrification has many parents. Myth stylized trauma. The memory of fire often borrows the shape of thunder. The point is not proof but posture. Humility in the face of a world that has ended itself, in part or in whole, more than once. Identity seeks bearings under all this. Deuteronomy speaks of scattering to the ends of the earth, of curses shadowing those who turn from the covenant, of nations with swift eagles and foreign tongues descending, of captivity revisited on descendants, and of a compassionate gathering when hearts turn and hands open. Communities read their stories into these lines, whether by blood, faith, or a tapestry of both. Diaspora becomes more than demography. It becomes destiny under threat and honor under pressure. Urban centers house millions and place millions inside the target folders of those who dream of humiliation as strategy. Movements arise naming themselves as tribes once scattered, now awaken, believing themselves sealed for preservation in a time of cutting. In mature forms, such movements produce communities sober about responsibility and less concerned with triumphalism than with holiness under sirens. In immature forms, they harden into superiority and grievance that breeds mirrors of the oppressions they denounce. The texts encourage discernment over memes. Politics converts all this into chorography. Autocracies parade throw weight and second strike as sacraments. Democracies campaign on modernization budgets and red lines that can corner later statesmen. Domestic legitimacy is a jealous idol. It demands sacrifices on schedules that ignore diplomatic calendars. A prime minister needs a headline. A general needs a budget line. A party needs a foil. Words that steal home crowds can panic neighbors. A single flourish can undo months of back-channel repair. In brittle polities, generals arbitrate civilian disputes and then forget to leave. In alliances, grievances about contributions and constraints ferment into distrust. Multilateral bodies built to transcend sovereign tantrums find themselves paralyzed by vetoes. The docket grows longer, the patience grows shorter. Warnings do their work with images and clocks. A stylized timepiece inches toward midnight. Critics call the meter subjective and the metaphor exhausted. Advocates answer that subjectivity is the only honest language for a world whose risks are entangled, that nuclear peril cannot be quarantined from climate stress, or democratic decay. Citizens, meanwhile, tire. Panic is unsustainable. Boredom is corrosive. The craft is to speak without hysteria and without anesthesia, to tell the truth about risk in sentences that do not numb. So how should a people live when their leaders sit on codes? One answer is retreat. Gardens, children, hymns, the humble care of neighbors. Another is idolatry. Banners, boasts, the fetish of command. Between them is a path that looks like sobriety. Deter without dehumanizing. Plan without preening. Exercise without theatrical menace. Speak precisely. Listen for the crackle of miscommunication and damp it before it becomes fire. That path demands a doctrine of adversaries as human beings, frightened, fallible, and sometimes wicked, rather than as abstractions in generals' presentations. It asks that we keep two truths in one mind. Our deterrent must be credible. Our rhetoric must not be cultic. The scriptures do not end in despair. They are relentless about judgment and equally relentless about mercy. The scriptures do not end in despair. They are relentless about judgment and equally relentless about mercy. Days are shortened so that flesh survives. Angels hold back winds until sealing completes. Plagues fall on those who devour the poor and dress violence in law, like a refiner's fire burning away dross, or a launderer's soup scurrying stains that normal politics ignores. Zechariah's wasting disease looks like radiation to modern medicine. Perhaps the teaching is that consequence is not airy. Isaiah's chariots and whirlwind look like modern force projection. Perhaps the teaching is that power always arrives with a moral agenda. Daniel's furnace that fails to singe faithful hair looks like a parable of resilience under catastrophe. Not that the faithful escape fire, but that they are not consumed by it. Restoration follows. Cities ruins inhabited, West planted. The promise is not that catastrophe is avoided by cleverness, but that catastrophe is not final when mercy intervenes. If August 2nd, 0 to 5 is a hing, it opens onto specific work. States must harden their chains of command and their ethics of command. They must test fail-safes and practice grace under false alarms. Restoration follows. Cities rebuilt, ruins inhabited, West planted. The promise is not that catastrophe is avoided by cleverness, but that catastrophe is not final when mercy intervenes. If August 2nd, 025 is a hinge, it opens onto specific work. States must harden their chains of command and their ethics of command. They must test fail-safes and practice grace under false alarms. They must reopen inspection regimes fit for ambiguity, count payloads by modes, not just by treaties, adjectives. They must build and protect deconfliction channels thick enough to carry humiliation without snapping. They must speak in public as if words were triggers, because they sometimes are. They must insulate decision loops from cyber tricks and space vandalism. They must train operators to default to caution when uncertainty peaks, and to escalate only when escalation is unmistakably forced. They must discipline militaries to distrust innovations that promise control over uncontrollable thresholds. Societies must strengthen the tissues that keep shocks from killing organs. Invest in grids with redundancy, and in transformers that do not require half a world to build. Teach civil defense that does not sneer at itself. Stock municipal reservoirs and plan evacuation routes that are known by more than the planners. Support journalism that can pass a crisis without feeding it. Create political cultures that can argue at noon and cooperate at midnight. Carve out public rituals that recall cost and bind people into responsibilities larger than their screens. Educate children in history that can say, "We were wrong," and in literature that teaches them to recognize their own faces in their enemies' faces, before disaster erases faces altogether. Communities of faith, reading these years as prophecy's clock, must avoid kitsch and embrace formation. The task is less prediction than preparation, less decoding than discipling. Practice hospitality that disarms fear. Teach prayers that steady hands. Confront charlatans who sell vengeance as holiness. Learn the unglamorous arts of rebuilding. Masonry, medicine, governance without graft. The ceiling that texts describe is not a stamp for pride. It is a responsibility to stand near the center when winds rise and to be, somehow, a windbreak. Skeptics will demand proof that 1945 to 2025 is anything more than numerology. They will point to decades in which arsenals expanded and yet did not fire in anger, to past alarms that did not transform into flames. To scholarly consensus that apocalyptic imagery is a genre designed to encourage the oppressed, not scripts for statesmen. These cautions should be absorbed, not dismissed. Then the prudent will ask different questions. Have deterrence structures frayed? Have decision windows shrunk? Have technologies multiplied ambiguity? Has political rhetoric coarsened and polarized beyond what systems can bear? Are the consequences of error graver because interdependence is deeper? If answers run yes more often than no, action does not need a prophet stamp to be urgent. It simply needs will. Style is not superficial in this work. Repetition dulls. Formula numbs. The human mind becomes a predictive text machine, filling in cliches and letting new information pass unattended. That is one reason the opening hook matters. Short, clean sentences that plant a flag and attention. It is also why the rest must vary pace and vocabulary, moving from image to map to ethic and back, so that attention is never allowed to coast. The goal is not to manipulate. It is to keep conscience awake. History has already shown that mercy operates in mundane ways. A radar officer choosing to wait, a submarine captain disbelieving a false message, a leader absorbing a day of humiliation rather than seizing an hour of decisive retaliation, an engineer catching a flaw before a launch, a diplomat finding a phrase that allows a rival to step back without losing face. These are not mythic interventions. They are grace distributed through vocations. They are the hands that hold back the winds a little longer. They are also teachable. Institutions can honor such decisions, study them, and ingrain the conditions that make them more likely. Clear protocols for ambiguity, cultures that reward caution under uncertainty, training that inoculates against panic and vanity. They are the hands that hold back the winds a little longer. They are also teachable. Institutions can honor such decisions, study them, and ingrain the conditions that make them more likely. Clear protocols for ambiguity, cultures that reward caution under uncertainty, training that inoculates against panic and vanity. Looking ahead, prudence asks for habits that governments often find tedious and publics often find boring. Update hotlines. Run joint simulations with adversaries not to show prowess, but to expose brittle assumptions on both sides. Rebuild verification with sensors that fit new flight profiles. Ring-fence nuclear command from commercial networks. Audit software in systems that, if hacked, turn exercises into incidents. Pair every military exercise with a diplomatic exercise. Rehearsal of statements that de-escalate. not just those that deter. Normalize third-party mediation that can be summoned without stigma. Teach publics the difference between resolve and chest thumping. There is also a need to rethink victory and defeat in nuclear shadow. Victory cannot be the adversary's surrender under mushroom clouds. Defeat cannot be backing away from a spiral before the spiral owns the room. There are victories of forbearance, defeats of hubris. Strategic literature must teach them, and political cultures must reward leaders who deliver them. The emerging generation, whose strongest memories are of pandemics and climate shocks, will not accept Cold War theatrics as statesmanship. They need a doctrine that respects their intelligence and their fear, one that does not gaslight them with forced cheer or drown them in a fetish of risk. The scriptural promise that days are shortened for the sake of the elect can be read, in one register, as a statement about time's owner interrupting catastrophe. In another, it is a lesson in the limits of human control. We do not get to choose how long we have. We only choose how we use the hours. If the hand that shortens days is merciful, then our task is to be people for whom shortened days still suffice. Clear-eyed, quick to repent error, quicker to repair harm, slower to threaten, slower still to despise. The sealing on foreheads is not a tattoo of superiority, but a marker of service, an assignment to hold ground when storms test foundations. The holding back of winds is a reprieve, not a guarantee. Reprieves are for learning. The closing claim must therefore reject both fatalism and fantasy. The atomic age began with a bell that cannot be unrung, but bells can signal many things. They can warn. They can call to assembly. They can announce restraint. They can toll for the dead and also for the living to reckon with what debt they carried to the future. 80 years is a span within which a civilization can grow wise or merely old. To grow, we must renew hard instruments of safety and remake soft instruments of trust. We must speak truth without cruelty and practice power without worshipping it. We must rebuild, if rebuilding is required, without recreating the conditions that demanded rebuilding in the first place. Start where the hook begins. Short sentences. Claim. Every empire eventually collapses. This is not an invitation to nihilism. It is an inoculation against pride. The threshold we face is real. This is not an invitation to panic. It is a summons to grown-up attention. The patterns in Scripture are not toys for speculative play. They are moral weather reports advising travelers on how to walk. The maps of arsenals are not excuses for paralysis. They are reasons to build institutions that help frail human beings make good decisions under bad conditions. Stand still for a moment in this year. Listen to the clocks. Read texts that are older than empires and therefore outlast them. Look at maps that show both missile fields and watersheds. Visit a transformer substation and a neonatal ward and ask what their staff need when the lights flicker. Ask a radar operator about boredom and about terror. Ask a diplomat about humiliation and about grammar. Ask a city councillor about budgets and about sirens. Ask a pastor, an imam about hope when prudence strains and about prudence when hope runs hot. Ask elders what the last 80 years taught, and ask children what the next 80 should be for. Write those answers down. Build policy and culture and law around them. Every empire eventually collapses. Rome eroded. Babylon faded. We are not called to be an empire. We are called to be a people who refuse lies, refuse idolatry, refuse despair, and refuse to treat human beings anywhere as expendable. 80 years after atomic fire consumed a city, the world stands again at a threshold. It is not inevitable that we cross it into ruin. It is possible to stand, to turn, to work, to watch, to reconcile, to rebuild in ways that make the threshold less a precipice and more a gate into cleaner air. The Hebrew scriptures did more than hint at upheaval. They taught that judgment and mercy arrive together. If we are wise, we will meet them with humility, with prudence, with courage, and with a hope that works.